Hello and welcome to Dateline London. Russia, NATO and Syria. David Cameron says that social mobility just is not working in Britain. And FIFA's ethics committee, yes, there really is one, gets tough. My guests today are Guney Yildiz, who is a journalist from Turkey, Nesrine Malik, who is a Sudanese writer, Jef McAllister, who is an American writer and broadcaster, and Ned Temko, who is an author and journalist. Syria first, and Russia's actions, including firing cruise missiles, propping up the Assad regime and entering Turkish airspace, have proved a new test for an old alliance, NATO. Britain is also sending a small number of soldiers to the Baltic states and Ukraine to remind Russia that there's a limit to tolerable activity. Should there now be some kind of conference, including Russia, on the future of Syria and perhaps on relations within Europe? And first of all, I want to begin with the weekend news about the bombing in Ankara, with dozens of people killed, many more injured. I mean, what do you make of what's been going on there?
Well, two similar previous attacks were blamed on IS. In the last 5 months, three similar attacks took place. One was targeting directly the pro-Kurdish party election rally in Diyarbakir. The other one targeting pro-Kurdish youth. The second attack actually kicked off the increased violence between the Kurdish rebels and Turkey. But most people who were the callers of this demonstration today are blaming government, at least for not doing enough to prevent such attacks. And they blame, it was a peace rally. It was calling for peace and democracy. And
the government says, sorry to interrupt, but the government is saying this was a terrorist attack. Exactly. Is their view. Exactly.
I mean, the previous attacks were blamed on IS. Exactly. But people on this rally who were targeted by these bombs were blaming the government to start to resort to violence against the PKK, to prop up nationalism and to increase their votes and to push the pro-Kurdish party below the 10% threshold, which will allow the Turkish ruling party to have much more seats in the parliament.
The AKP, which has failed last time, and there's another election, we should say, at the big 1st of November?
Exactly. This is happening against the 1st November election, but it's also in a way linked to with the IS connection, linked to what's happening in Syria, and Kurds play an important role in Syria too, which does not always converge. Their interests do not always converge with the interests of Turkish government. So there's a link to Syria as well in this one.
I just wonder how this is seen in the United States, because we've also heard this week that the Obama administration is rethinking its policy towards Syria, basically because it's not working. And actually, when people talk about the moderate groups fighting Assad, there's a great deal of skepticism that these groups even exist.
I want to read, actually, what Obama said, because it's such a great encapsulation. And when I hear people offering up half-baked ideas as if they were solutions or trying to downplay the challenges involved, what I'd like to see people ask is specifically, precisely, what exactly would you do? And how would you fund it? And how would you sustain it? And typically what you get is a bunch of mumbo-jumbo. And that's where the American government has felt it has been for a long time, and it still is. It's tried things, they're not working. There are people that the CIA has funded. Are they doing anything? How do you get anywhere with this mess? I mean, we see with Putin, he has a solution, let's bomb. And maybe that's enough to keep Assad propped up for some little while, but he's not going after IS, he's going after mostly the groups that are against Assad. And when your question, should there be a peace conference, essentially, who shows up? Who can they control if they agree to anything? I don't see that any of the ingredients are on the ground for a political solution, and therefore all I can see is more bombing by more groups, more mess, unless somebody's willing to march in with boots. And the Turks are not going to do it. The Iranians are having a great time doing it by proxy.
Who knows what the Russians will do? But I mean, I suspect we might all agree on this table that lack of explosions is not the problem in Turkey, in Syria rather. Lack of bombing is not really the core of the problem, is it?
Yeah, and I think what's happening now is that all these solutions people are proposing in piecemeal fashion are just extending the situation further, is the problem. Is that the entire Syrian conflict has not been allowed to kind of fall apart in its own way, if that makes sense. So many people and different parties have intervened. You've got Hezbollah, you've got Iran, you've got Turkey, NATO, the US, and now Russia.
And you've missed out Saudi Arabia.
And well, we just assume Saudi Arabia is always involved in the Middle East somehow. And so if you try and kind of think about this in terms of how we can get anything over the line, the problem is with every step forward, there's another step backwards because another party has intervened in a different way. And so if one can be, if we're going to get somewhere, I think beyond saying, what a mess, everyone should just kind of butt out because they're all just looking out for their interests. I think this one way that is not mumbo-jumbo is to actually try and get some Arab leaders, and I know it's pointless, but it's the only way that anything is going to happen on the ground in Syria. I think it's...
Where are they?
Yeah.
Where are these guys?
But don't you think it's so interesting that whenever we talk about Syria, we mention the US, Russia, NATO. So this is an Arab country in the heartland of the Arab, you know, the Levantine Peninsula, and no one is mentioning Jordan or Iraq or Lebanon
or the Arab League.
Or the Arab League. I mean, the Arab League doesn't come into it.
But what assets now would they have to bring to bear to the problem, given all the guns and money and everything sloshing around there?
The Gulf has huge sway in the Arab world. They have huge financial sway, and they have huge proxy influence on the West's policy sway.
They're not taking many refugees there either.
They're not taking
Aren't the Saudis already doing that, though?
But they're not exercising. No, the way the Saudis are intervening in Syria, the way they do in all Arab conflicts, is via money to some disparate, moderate Sunni groups. And so they choose not to exercise any of their financial or proxy political
kept
sway.
me from asking.
You're
I'm
last.
going to solve this problem.
Okay, that's good.
Good.
No, unfortunately, I don't have a solution. But
it's mumbo jumbo.
It is mumbo jumbo. No, the one thing I would add is I don't think just leaving this conflict to its own devices is a solution either, because it will be just more bloodbath, and it's a perfect solution for an increasingly violent war of attrition, because no side is likely to win.
And an expanding war of attrition,
yes.
because there are those who think, I've talked to British diplomats who think that Putin really has made a terrible mistake because he's stirring up more resentment
within... Which was to be my next point.
Muslim communities in his own country.
I agree with that completely. I think the West, I think it's easy to criticize Obama, and I was critical of the Obama administration and much of the West in the early stages of this conflict, because I think there was a prospect for the West being more intelligently involved earlier on, before ISIS was there, it was easier at the beginning, and the West were absent. And even when we set our so-called red lines, chemical weapons, a combination of Ed Miliband's, how can I put it delicately, adolescent geopolitics and the Americans...
By not voting in favor of
that basically once you draw a red line and say you can't gas your own people, it kind of, that's the end of any coherent policy. But I think Obama is right now. There's nothing the Americans or the West can do except make it worse. But my final point about Putin is I think it's wrong to assume that Putin is acting out of strength, intelligence, or coherency, because none of that is true.
But I want to come back then to Turkey, because, you know, here we have a NATO member with Russian planes straying into its airspace. We've got some kind of terrorism, perhaps from IS, but perhaps other people think it's actually forces within the Turkish state itself that's doing this. A country which has been on the democratic path, that's been economically successful, but is actually in a considerable degree of trouble now.
Exactly. With regard to Syria, actually what Russia is doing is to exploit the political vacuum left there by the West and their allies, primarily Turkey, Qatar and Saudi Arabia there. When you look at what Russia is doing, it makes more sense militarily, because they have an air power now in Syria and they have ground troops to work with. Whereas if you look at the Western side, yes, US has an air base in Turkey, which is very close to Syria, and they have, as in the form of Kurdish rebels in Syria, Kurdish forces, a ground troop which is very effective against IS. They took more territory from IS than anybody else in Iraq and Syria. But the problem with the West is these two potential allies, Turkey and the Kurds in Syria, are fighting against each other, or in a bitter hostility against each other. So that's one of the reasons why the Western policy does not work there. And it was interesting when the Russian planes infringed on Turkish airspace, that Turkish government tried to play it down initially. but it was NATO. And Turkish government said, oh, they've told us they're not going to do it again. It's not a big deal.
It was a mistake.
It was a mistake. But then NATO came up and said it wasn't a mistake. They upped their tone. It was clear that Russia is sending a message to NATO, even bypassing Turkey there. And Turkey's policies in the last couple of years with backing possibly wrong rebel groups on the ground makes it even more passive in Syria.
NATO has been sending various messages to Russia as well by troop deployments in the Baltics, but we haven't got time for that. Now, David Cameron told us this week he was a compassionate conservative. He reminded us that social mobility just is not working in Britain, and he promised to attack poverty. Do his actions undermine his words? Well, that's certainly the way some of the protesters thought about in terms of tax credits and so on, the changes to welfare that are going to take place over the next year or so.
Yeah, I think that this pledge from Cameron cannot be seen outside of the context of kind of Tory triumphalism in general. Because if you think about it, they're a party that is sort of completely victorious after the last general election. They have a laughing stock, as far as they see it, of an opposition in the Labour Party. And I think that was kind of Cameron's way of saying, you know, we've won, but we're not going to crow about it. We're still going to be compassionate conservatives. But their policies, like you said, completely undermine it. Tax credits, affordable homes, only kind of the Making Homes Affordable scheme is only accessible to kind of average income Britons rather than the poor income citizens. And in general, the whole social mobility conversation is one that, if one looks at the numbers, hasn't changed over the past 100 years. And so what is he intending to do about social mobility in Britain as part?
Well, he would say, sorry to interrupt, but you'd say making work pay, you know, increasing the minimum wage, changing tax thresholds, which change for people. I mean, he said that's what he says.
But these are not things, remember, these are things that he pledged, passionate conservatism was pledged 10 years ago. And so this is a tonal return to kind of the beginning of his pledges. And he's had 10 years to kind of buttress any of this with action. And all we've seen is cuts, all we've seen is austerity, and all we've seen is tax credit undermining. And so you think, is this just rhetoric, just triumphant rhetoric?
Ned, what do you think?
First of all, I don't think this was a way of saying we're not going to crow. I think this was a seriously thought out part of political strategy by both Cameron and George Osborne. And I think it was a deliberate attempt to take not just the center ground of British politics, but the center left ground of British politics. That the long-term aim, as a couple of people on the BBC said quite rightly, you could understand, you could see Tony Blair delivering exactly the same speech.
Some people did think it was a kind of New Labour speech, didn't they?
This is kind of new Tory plus New Labour. I would say two things about the specifics. One, you're right, that there is going to be some dissonance, and this is going to be very closely watched. And for the Tories, the next 18 months or so are going to be really tricky because Osborne has front-loaded a lot of these cuts in the aim of being able to ease them in the second half. And then the other thing...
Before the next election, when he hopes to be leader of the party, is the view of many people.
Now, the other thing, and this is based on, although I'm no longer covering politics, I was chief political correspondent of The Observer during David Cameron's adolescence in politics when he was running for Tory party leader. And I think this is the genuine David Cameron. I think he is a socially liberal conservative. I think he's of a generation where things like gay rights, equal rights for women, all of this is supremely non-controversial in a way that it wasn't always for the Tory party. So I think that part, at least, is kind of genuine.
I'm interested in also the thought that in the next year or two, he has got some huge challenges. I mean, the European Union referendum is the most obvious one. But funding the NHS, as we've just seen, almost £1 billion in a quarter overspent in, you know, one section of it. There are absolutely huge challenges for him.
I agree. And also, if they really are going to keep to their debt reduction targets, if you do have to cut many government departments by 30 or 40%, which still is in the plan.
To protect a few others.
The NHS, which still needs more money than it's getting. I agree that a lot of this is going to come home to roost. And it's an interesting thing. I mean, in the same way that Tony Blair stole the kind of Thatcherite rhetoric and made it safe for Labour to say things that had been previously unpalatable, this is a great rhetorical trick. You can hug a hoodie and you can be pro-environment, and then you can also be stern as hell on welfare, and you can say we're austere and we're responsible. You're sort of everything to everybody, but you're everything to the percentage of the electorate that's likely to vote, especially with Labour being, they think, in disarray for some time. Yeah. Maybe the Corbyn magic, as it works for the Labour
new
Party,
politics.
If all these cuts are as severe and miserable as it turns out, we'll have a rebound. That's, I suppose, what they have to worry about, although I don't think they worry about the messenger particularly. But I think they do have a lot to be concerned about, especially if the economy doesn't go as perfectly as it needs to when the money becomes even tighter.
Really?
I think there's a fatigue in austerity politics as well. I mean, you can only sell austerity politics to the public for several years. It's now. And with the victory of Jeremy Corbyn, it obviously affected the landscape in British politics, which it had an effect of moving the whole politics slightly to left. And what Cameron is obviously calculating, that he's leaving the centre-left ground. Corbyn is leaving the centre-left ground open for Tories to address and to gain some votes from them. And also there's the case of Tory triumphalism, in which David Cameron feels less under pressure in terms of pressure of re-election. I mean, he feels it easier to go back to actually where he started. He's using a discourse very similar to the discourse he has been using maybe 10 years ago.
But also, to drive home the point that if you want someone to talk to you about inequality, go to Labour. If you want something done about it, come to the Conservatives.
But I'm really struck this week in particular that we have such big issues on the political agenda. We have Syria, we have the EU, we have the whole state of the economy, the question of whether there could be another recession, slowdown in China, A lot of the British press has been focused on the fact that Jeremy Corbyn, quote, snubbed, unquote, the Queen by not turning up for a Privy Council meeting when actually David Cameron took a few months before he went. You know, I mean, how do you see the kind of overall press coverage of Corbyn?
Well, I think that the overall press coverage of Corbyn and generally British press coverage of politics is slightly Monty Python-esque, in that you think there's so much going on in the world. Like you said, emerging markets slow down, China economic slowdown, Syria in disarray, serious tectonic shift plates kind of shifting around the world. And if you look at the British press, it's so hermetic and it's so inward-looking and it's so petty. And I don't know if that's because England as a nation, or Britain as a nation, is kind of inward-looking and hermetic and becoming kind of more American in that sense, or because the political leaders that we have are small and kind of not kind of statesman-like enough to inspire that kind of coverage, if you see what I mean.
How do you see it? I mean, you've been an admirer, obviously, of the British press for many years. What do you reckon?
I mean, I think there's an old-fashioned narrative that the right-wing press owners in many of these journals love to kick Jeremy Corbyn, and he's a new face. And
but he's such an easy target.
He's so easy. I mean, it's Michael Foot on steroids.
I think it undermines them more than it does him, to be honest.
No, so I mean, I think there's that old-fashioned one. I mean, I think the British press can be fantastic, but I think the phone hacking scandal, which we don't talk about much anymore, you know, there's an awful lot of it that is essentially unreformed.
Yeah.
Is still
the British press broke the FIFA scandal, which we'll get on to in a moment.
But how was the American prosecutors who did that?
No, I think they eventually got. But you find this true that the British anyway.
No,
but we'll get on to that in a second. But I mean, do you think it's just kind of trivial stuff? It's politics of distraction. It's not that we can't do anything about Syria, the economy, China. But look at this guy. He's quite funny, isn't he? Because he snubbed the Queen.
But newspapers the world over can't stand the steady diet of serious stuff all the time. They just don't.
Readers don't like
and the tabloids, the tabloids have a particular niche for not bothering with a lot of the serious stuff, except if it grinds an axe. So I don't think it's particularly different or worse now than it has been.
Would you care to defend, the former Fleet Street?
It's a little. It's tricky. It's tricky because I grew up on Watergate. I'm from Washington, and American political journalism, and I hate to be pro-American because it's not a good thing to be in.
Yeah, I understand.
That's,
okay.
But in that area, in its boring way, in its boring First Amendment way, there was something almost pristine about American political journalism, which in my experience, and I worked for the best, in my view, political kind of broadsheet in the country, The Observer. In Britain, even the best of political journalism, I think, is about narrative. It's about kind of getting
and it's partisan as well.
Yes,
and I would hate not only
you don't want to be
pro-American,
you
but to defend
watch yourself,
pro-Americanism. Even though this was, the Watergate scandal was years ago, there is still the aspiration, I think, in America to be kind of pristine political journalists. But I think
to be uninvolved,
and to be unbiased.
Let's move on to another pro-American story, which is FIFA, because over many months, when I've used the words FIFA's Ethics Committee to describe the moral guardians within football's governing body, interviewees have generally fallen about with laughter. Well, now this Ethics Committee has suspended FIFA's president, Sepp Blatter. Can FIFA reform from within the world's most popular sport and the way it's organised? What do you I mean, triumph of the Americans. Well done.
Yeah, I won't take too much credit. But I think the fundamental requirements are the ones that the Americans are good at, which is sort of due process, transparency. You need to have systems and checks and balances and a lot more ventilation. And the Swiss...
Bring in Putin. He'll say.
Yeah, exactly. The Swiss have changed their laws to allow now... I mean, one of the strange things about it was that all of these organizations, sports organizations based in Switzerland, were exempt from essentially any regulation, no taxes, no anti-competition regulations, and their bosses had no worry about having their bank accounts inspected. Well, the Swiss have now moved a little bit in the direction of opening that up. How you reconstitute this thing with all these groups who have to vote for the president, who are all essentially in the trough one way or the other, or have been, and all part of a very closed system where the money sloshes around. And what are they actually selling? They're selling image. There's no widgets that they sell. Somehow, you think, I'll take $1 billion of that, I'll take $1 million of that. Why not? I mean, just to make somebody else look
they're
better.
They're selling health and achievement, which is why they're sponsored by Coca-Cola, Budweiser, McDonald's.
And the sponsors never do anything except say, oh, that's a shame. They must do better. Right. So I do think, actually, it's the law and the regulators who are going to force the organization to do better.
Guney, what do you say?
Well, Turkish football, for example, had its own fair share of corruption as well. But the issue, FIFA is not the only sports body that had corruption and at least ethical inaccuracies. IOC had a similar problem, and they came out of that by involving people from outside. Well, it's even more difficult for FIFA because you can't have enough incentives to push people who has the power to start a reform, and it's also constitutionally difficult. You need to get 75% of the votes of its members to push for a change. All this makes it really difficult to get a reform.
I think the whole FIFA thing is a wonderful political and philosophical case study, because it's not about football, it's about human nature. It's about how you run organizations and actually how you run political systems. And if you think about it as kind of a metaphor, the way I think about it is kind of a metaphor, an Arab Spring state. So you have, the dictator...
Another Syria?
Yeah. The dictator, eventually being toppled and then being replaced by another dictator, because the people who are being slated to replace Blatter are princes and princelings from various parts of the Arab world, and I'm not entirely sure how much of a new kind of fresh start.
Maybe Assad is looking for a new job. He could
Assad, or maybe some hidden Gaddafi somewhere can take it. And so that's the second thing, is kind of the permanence of dictatorship, really, in that kind of scenario. And the third thing is the West intervening on kind of some moral high ground to make things better. And so I think if you think about it that way, it makes it clear that it's actually not about the corporate structure or the financing or the fact that people can be bribed. It's just the challenges of running a political organization when there's so much money and power.
Well, isn't it partly, if people think they can get away with things, they will try to get away with things until they get caught.
FIFA. That's true.
And I mean, why do you see it? Is it reformable from within?
No.
Right.
That was easy. But the good news is all they do, essentially, is organize the World Cup. It's not as if they run football all over the world. So once every 4 years, we have this spectacle of bribe taking. And unless you can find someone, you need a kind of elder statesman. You're on the right track, like, you know, someone who's got time on his hands and sort of...
Tony Blair.
Well, Tony Blair would be good, or
Kofi Annan.
Yeah,
Kofi Annan, actually.
Yeah,
would be,
Tony Blair cleared up the Middle East in his last job. It's all fine now.
Well,
so
that's
he
right.
can
This
take
is
over
equally
FIFA.
sort of, or yeah,
More complicated, perhaps.
or you know, the new head of the Labour Party, perhaps. I mean, he's got. I mean, he's not
Jeremy Corbyn
yes.
could do it.
I think he's
I mean,
got another job
with
for a
new
while.
politics. No, but I mean, that is the problem. How do you get somebody outside a body to run the body?
difficult.
When
The
you
IOC
have to-
Well,
did a
when
good
you
job.
arrest
Yeah.
all the people inside, then I think then they finally wake up.
that would
That's
be.
because he's a lawyer. He
He is a lawyer. That would be a strategy. All right, Jeff, thanks very much for your insights. That's it for Dateline London for this week. You can comment on the programme on Twitter @Gavin Esler. We're back next week at the same time. Please make a date with Dateline. Thanks for watching and